Imagine waking up in a concrete cell the size of a bathroom. Through a narrow window, you can see the skyline of San Francisco. At night, the city lights are so bright they reflect off the water in your cell. That shore is exactly 1 mile away. On a calm day, it looks like a distance any strong swimmer could handle. But the water here rarely stays calm. The temperature hovers around 48 degrees, cold enough to cause a person's lungs to seize, and the currents move at speeds that can sweep a body out to the open ocean in minutes. For 30 years, prison officials told the public that no one could survive a swim from the island. Then, in June of 1962, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin attempted to prove them wrong. 60 years later, their names remain on the FBI's most wanted list. The case is still officially open because no one has ever proven if they reached the shore or if the bay claimed them. Before it was a prison, Alcatraz was a military fortress.
Its position at the mouth of the bay made it the perfect site for cannons and a lighthouse to guard the entrance to the west coast. Military planners realized the island's geography offered a unique advantage. The natural barrier of the freezing, high-velocity water was more effective than any fence. In 1934, the government converted the site into a federal penitentiary. It was designed to house inmates who had already attempted to escape from other prisons across the country. The Department of Justice intended for Alcatraz to be the final stop for prisoners who were too dangerous or too cunning for the rest of the federal system. The most effective security measure was the isolation. Inmates spent 23 hours a day in these narrow cells. There were no radios and no news from the outside world for much of the prison's history. Every movement was dictated by a whistle or a bell.
From the morning count to the evening lockup, the routine was designed to be so monotonous that it would eventually erode an inmate's will to resist. Even notorious figures like Al Capone found their influence ended at the dock. On the island, Capone wasn't a mob boss, he was a number, assigned to a cell and forced into the same rigid schedule as everyone else. Officials believed that by stripping away hope and individuality, they could prevent even the most determined men from thinking about the world beyond the walls. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers spent months scraping at the aging concrete around their ventilation ducts. They used sharpened spoons and a makeshift drill they assembled from a stolen vacuum motor. They worked at night, timing their movements to the sounds of the prison's music hour to mask the noise of the crumbling stone. To buy themselves an 8-hour head start, they built these decoys. They used a mixture of soap, toilet paper, and paint, then finished them with real hair swept up from the barbershop floor. On the night of June 11th, they slipped through the holes they had carved in their walls. They climbed through a narrow utility corridor and squeezed out through a ventilator on the roof. They carried a raft they had built by hand, using more than 50 raincoats stitched together and sealed with heat from a steam pipe. At the water's edge, they inflated it using a small concertina and vanished into the fog. The next morning, a guard tried to wake Morris and realized he was staring at a painted head. By then, the men had been gone for hours. With nothing but stolen kitchen utensils and raincoats, these 3 inmates turned the prison's own utility corridors and ventilation shafts into a path to the shore. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in its history. Coast Guard boats and helicopters spent days searching the bay, while divers investigated the seabed around the island. Authorities eventually recovered a few floating items and a paddle, but no bodies were ever found. The Bureau eventually concluded the men drowned before they could reach the mainland. In the decades since, unverified evidence has periodically surfaced. Letters arrived at police stations allegedly penned by the fugitives, and a photograph was discovered in South America showing 2 men who closely resemble the Anglin brothers. Despite the escape, the prison remained open for another year. It only closed because of the logistics. Transporting every meal and gallon of fresh water to the island made the facility 3 times more expensive to run than any other prison in the country. Today, the cell blocks are silent, preserved as a museum. Visitors can still see the utility corridors the men climbed, and the holes they spent months carving into the concrete. Maybe the bay performed exactly as the engineers intended, or maybe 3 men found a way to survive the most notorious prison in American history. If you want to see more stories like this, subscribe and hit the bell.